into the section on genetics and microbiology. Okay. Now, if you'll recall, last week we talked a little bit about what's going on with Charlie Darwin and all of his shenanigans and all that stuff. So we'll try to do that, try to get a little bit further along. Now, again, I want to emphasize that Darwin usually gets made into one of three people, and I don't necessarily think he deserves that. Okay. Before I was called to teach the sciences, I was all prepared to teach history. That was my deal. I used to read 14 hours a day, mostly World War II history. But anyway, so Jefferson's still going to be. He used to read 16 hours a day. Anyway, so do what?
So you just gotta up your game.
I know, right? Like I have electricity. I don't have to burn candles to do that. Okay, so he's not really any of the above. Okay, he's not a lightweight. Okay, he did have doubts about his theory. Again, he wrote 2 chapters in his original book about all the reasons why you might not want to believe in evolution. Okay. He definitely did not convert to Christianity. Okay, he is burning in hell right now. He wasn't vocal about his anti-religious stance, but if you read his private correspondence, he is very much against the church. He made the same mistake almost all the humans make, which is to blame God for the problems in the church. Almost everybody does that. Okay. Unfortunately, he had a really bad experience in the church. Okay, I know a lot of people who have really bad experiences in the church, including some of my own students, and it's hard to blame them when they're like, "Well, I'm done. I'm out of here," you know. And I don't, you know, that almost everybody does that, right? So that is why you shouldn't name Christ unless you're serious about actually following what he has to say. Anyway, so Darwin was none of those, born into a Christian family. In 1809, back when the world's population was 8 times smaller, okay, it's a whole different planet over here. Okay, very little railroads running around. 1809, isn't that the year, or very close to the year that Napoleon crowns himself Emperor of France? I want to say it's 1811 or 1812 or something. Anyway. He attends Christ College, which is now Cambridge. He achieves his ordinary degree. A lot of people are like, well, he actually had a degree in the Bible. He actually has a degree in theology. Sort of, not really. At that time, that's about the only degree that they offered. I know, yeah, 200 years changed a lot. You had to take a lot of religion classes in order to go to college. And basically, if you wanted to become a scientist at that time, you basically had to join the priesthood. That doesn't seem like a good idea. Anyway, so he got as a prerequisite to a divinity degree, ends up taking a whole bunch of electives, science classes as electives. Okay. Gets himself a cushy government job on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, right? As a naturalist, so they used to carry around scientists back in those days because, hey, they're going to the Galapagos, so might as well bring somebody along who can, you know, draw these critters because you couldn't actually photograph them, right? He hated the medical sciences. Of course, that's his family business. His dad and his grandfather are doctors, but he cannot stand the sight of blood and basically drops out of pre-medical school and eventually specialized actually in geology. Okay, he just hung out with the other scientists, which is again not really a bad plan. Okay, at that time, evolution is becoming a common worldview in college level stuff. This is usually where revolutions kind of start, right? With the young people, the young adults sort of test the boundaries, and they're like, wait a minute. How do you know all this stuff? And the church is like, because I said so, and that doesn't work. Okay, I'm not trying to pick on your parents when they say stuff like that, but I never tell my students or my kids that. I'll tell them something like, Well, why do I have to clean my room? Because we serve a God of order, and that is chaos. Right? They don't understand what I'm saying. I try not to say, because I said so, right? That's not a reason. That's tyranny, sort of. That's almost, it kind of is, though, isn't it? And, maybe you're entitled to be a tyrant in your house, and maybe you're not. Okay, the Bible says you're not supposed to exasperate your kids, and that probably applies to your students as well. That's just my opinion. Maybe I missed something in there. So he doesn't like the implications of the worldview. Darwin knows if you throw out the Bible, well, basically that means you can do whatever you want. That might not be a good idea. So he doesn't really want to talk about it. He doesn't personally believe it. Okay. But there's a whole bunch of people around him that are the vocal part of it. Like I think it's Wallace and Huxley that end up being called Darwin's bulldogs, right? Because yeah, it's his theory. They're out there preaching it like, this is the truth. We need to get rid of the church. We need to get rid of all these rules. And, burn everything down, and we'll rebuild it eventually, right? You've heard it before if you've read your history, or I don't know, watch the news, right? So he gets sick and tired of this debate, right? He's still sort of not really sure what's going on. He gets sick and tired of all these people debating whether evolution is true, whether God created it with evolution, or whether God exists. He's like, you know what? It ought to be obvious. This is Cartwright's position. It ought to be easy to tell. Just go out and study the sciences and see what you find. Okay, and that is what he does. But he has a little bit of a bias. Okay, so his original theory, well, let's call it a hypothesis, is a little bit different from the one that's floating around in all the government schools today. Okay, we call it Darwinism. Okay, that is flavor number one of Darwinian theory, and that is the idea that organisms build up characteristics by use and disuse. This is the idea, hey, if you work out and you pump irons and you go to the gym and you sort of bodybuilder and you get the old metabolism up and all that stuff, your kids will be stronger. Which is not really true. This is the idea. Oh yeah. So out in the savannah, you've got the horses out there, and they're trying to eat the leaves off the trees, and they're sort of stretching their necks out a little bit further every day. And over thousands of years, they hadn't invented millions of years by then, over thousands of years, the evolution of a new species, right? That was Darwin's idea, which is hilarious, okay? Today, it's a joke. Because we know Mendelian genetics, we know that is impossible. You can't change the genetic information you give to your kids. However, there's some evidence that you might be able to influence it, though. For example, if you eat a lot of sugar, your kids and grandkids are much more likely to get diabetes. Did you know that? If you abuse alcohol, your kids and grandkids are going to be much more susceptible to it, which freaks me out.
Even if you say you weren't their father past it, would they still have easier? Are you saying through growing up?
I'm saying it's not all nurture. It's not all how you were raised. Yeah. Some of it is genetic.
Yeah.
And we know populations of folks that have a real hard time with alcohol abuse. Some of that's genetic, okay? And some of it's another part of genetics, which is that they can't actually metabolize alcohol. So it's a real problem for you. Anyway, so whereas other people can metabolize it like nuts.
So is it possible, like, if your grandfather drank a lot and your dad drank a lot, that you could be more immune to alcohol?
No, I'm saying it's the opposite is true. You're more susceptible, right? If your population in Europe decided they were going to all distill alcohol in the early 1800s, and thousands of them died from alcohol poisoning, only the ones that can metabolize the alcohol survive. So if you have an Irish heritage, you can metabolize alcohol, because all the Irish that couldn't metabolize alcohol dead died, and you can't reproduce very well
When you're dead.
right? So, and again, that's some kind of like, it's emerging, right? I'm not saying that that's the hard and fast truth. It's brand new. We're still studying it. But it's a really, and I think it's a fascinating area of science about this whole argument about, well, how much of you is how you were raised, and how much of you is your genetics, and how much of you is your spiritual reality that, can only be realized with a relationship with the Lord. And right now we're saying a third, not limited. That's my opinion. Okay. Anyway, so I'm still learning about that stuff. So we know that Darwinism is bunk. By the way, they actually tested this idea that use and disuse could produce characteristics in organisms on mice. All right. I don't know if you know this, but mice don't really have any kind of muscles or nerves in their tail. If you read the Chronicles of Narnia, you know the mouse has a sense of pride in his tail. Okay. But they don't really use it for anything. Okay. So some scientists are like, okay, Darwin, I think we have a way we can test this thing right here. How about we cut off all these mouse tails? Might be embarrassing for them, but they'll be fine, right? And so he cut off the tails of all these mice with carving knives. I'm not really sure what he used, but yeah. So as soon as they're born, cuts off all their tails. So they live their whole life without a tail. They probably don't even remember having a tail. Their parents don't have tails. He does this for generation after generation after generation after generation with these mice, and they're all born with tails. And we all know, yeah, because they have the genetics for a tail. So obviously, you can get as many tattoos as you want. Your kids are not going to be born with tattoos, right? And maybe that's not. Anyway, so use and disuse is bunk. Okay, it's nonsense. We all know it's nonsense. Nobody believes that anymore. That was Darwin's original theory. However, we gotta pump the brakes a little bit. Wait a minute. Wait just a minute here, Cartwright. Aren't you saying, Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species, only affects organisms after they're alive? How do we get living things from non-living things? You're talking about the origin of the species. Shouldn't you talk about the origin of life first? And by the way, I think I mentioned this before, but I want to emphasize Darwin's original book, his original subtitle was The Origin of the Species and the Preservation of Favored Races. Did you know that? Have we talked about that before? Okay, Darwin was a bit of a racist. Now, if you go to his Wikipedia page today, you'll see all this kind of, oh my gosh, no, Darwin wasn't a racist. I mean, my goodness, he treated his slave very well. And first of all, no, he didn't. Okay, it's a bunch of bunk, people trying to, what's the word? Sterilize history, just sort of take all the things they don't like out of it, rewrite history is what they're trying to do. Darwin was a flaming racist, hung out with flaming racists. If you read some of the stuff that his best friends wrote, again, Darwin wasn't vocal about a lot of this stuff. Some of Darwin's contemporaries, the people he hung out with and was good friends with, said things like, the Aboriginal adult has the same intelligence as an 11-year-old Homo sapien, claiming that natives of Australia were so unintelligent they weren't even human, and they were comparable to like a little kid from Europeans, whatever. And if that doesn't make you, ugh. Anyway, so Darwin had reasons for why he published the book that had to do with Britain ruling the globe and conquering the entire planet. And yeah, we're supposed to because we're the smartest. Bunch of bull crap as far as I'm concerned. But that's why so many people grabbed onto evolution, because it means we can buy as many slaves as we want. No big deal. Slavery's in the Bible anyway. So yeah, not that kind of slavery. Slavery in the Bible was if you couldn't feed yourself, you might go sell yourself as a slave to a rich person. And basically you're saying, look, I'll work for you if you'll feed me.
You didn't take them.
Right.
You didn't, like,
yeah, you weren't out there like, how about we go down to Norman and get some slaves? Now, that wasn't a thing. That was not, just capture some people out there. that was not the biblical version of slavery. You didn't own the person and you didn't own their offspring, for heaven's sake. You only owned their work, which, by the way, is the same thing as a credit card, isn't it? A credit card, you're saying, look, I'll pay you with my future work.
They could leave if they wanted to.
Yes, I know. Yeah, they had to pay their debt off.
Yeah.
Right. But you could only be a slave for 7 years, right? So that means that you don't make loans to people if they can't pay it back. Right? We've seen, I don't know if you've seen, when the stock market crashed in 2008, because all these banks were making loans. Sorry. I don't mean to do that to you, but yeah, there was this time back when you were knee high to a grasshopper that the whole market crashed because banks were making loans to people they couldn't pay back. So there's all kinds of problems with that. Anyway, so biblical slavery has everything to do with paying off your debt. And oh, by the way, there's all kinds of warnings in there about don't go into debt. So unless you're starving, don't sell yourself into slavery. Credit card, bad idea. I haven't owned one in 10 years. You mean you don't have a credit score? Yeah, my credit score is 0. It's delicious. Don't have a credit card. I have a debit card.
Your enemies.
Oh yeah. So Darwin had reasons for, sorry to get so sidetracked. Darwin had reasons for what he was doing, and there's a reason why evolution swept over Europe, but not so much in America, because Europeans really wanted to rule the world. And Americans were like, look, we don't really want to rule the world. We just want to go from coast to coast, right? In fact, when Hawaii was annexed, there was a whole big movement in America. That's too much. It's too far. We can't possibly stretch ourselves over this whole planet. That's a bad idea. Look what happened to Great Britain. So, and they had a point. It takes a long time to get to Hawaii. I don't know if you ever tried walking there, but it's a good ways. Might want to, if you're gonna walk, make connections with Moses or something, okay? Okay, so Darwin's book only deals with things after they're alive, and that seems like, sure it does, right? Because obviously it would, because you can't possibly explain how things farted themselves into existence. That's impossible. Darwin didn't think he had to, though. It's a whole different world back then, you guys. And everybody just assumed that things could spontaneously generate. It was a very common worldview that rats came from garbage. That's where rats come from. We'll just set out a pile of garbage. A couple of weeks, there'll be rats there. Obviously, the rats came from the garbage, right? It's a very common worldview that fruit flies came from fruit. Well, after all, their eggs are microscopic, right? So if you don't know any better and you bring an apple into the house and all of a sudden there's fruit flies everywhere, you're like, oh, well, they came from the apple, right? Very common worldview that fleas hatched out of grains of sand and all this stuff, okay? That they just, bugs and things like that. They just came from dirt. They're just everywhere. They're ubiquitous. They're all over the place. You can't hardly get rid of them because they just poof, they just pop out of the ground. Now, that's ridiculous to us. But keep in mind, we're so much later in history than these guys are. Okay.
200 years later.
Yeah, 150 years or so. Pretty good distance. And at this time, in the mid 1800s, people were sort of recognizing, okay, rats don't come from garbage. Okay, they come from other rats. Fleas don't come from grains of sand. You can actually get a microscope and look and find their eggs and stuff like that. But microscopes were rare. They were built by hand. They ground the lenses by hand, you guys. You couldn't just go buy a microscope. You had to build your own. Galileo built his own telescope. Isaac Newton built his own telescope. Okay. That is difficult to do. It's extraordinarily expensive. And guess what? Going to a biology class in high school and there just being 5 microscopes lined up on the wall, that is not a thing. you probably would never have seen one. You might not even know anybody who had ever seen one, or much less looked through a microscope and actually seen these things. Okay, so believing that especially bacteria just popped up out of
I wonder if
whatever
microscopes
was very
an
common.
accidental discovery, or if someone was seeking out to find closure things.
Oh,
Were they seeking?
oh, it's
it
totally
out?
an accident. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they figured out how to do lenses, and I
Yeah.
want to say the 1600s, late 1600s. Some Dutch eyeglass make Dutch. You know, they used to rule the world too.
Yeah.
Some eyeglass maker figured out how to make lenses and became an eyeglass maker, I suppose, and figured out that you could put two lenses at a certain distance and make a telescope and really magnify things. And so some scientists built these telescopes, so they were looking towards the heavens. Others built microscopes to try to look at small stuff, but that's kind of weird though. And I think it was Leeuwenhoek, Otto von Leeuwenhoek, that built some of the first microscopes and described rainwater as being filled with little beasties. And he was freaking out, like, oh my gosh, there's all that he would, but he had put so much work into building this thing, there were very few people he would even allow to look through them, right? So a lot of people were like, yeah, little beasties, huh? In the water. Okay. All right. You've been smoking some of the good stuff, huh?
You've been drinking too much, your tears of your enemy.
Yeah, that's dangerous stuff there. Yeah, you got a little fire water, you've been partaking. Anyway, so there's a lot of folks that have never seen bacteria. They've never seen germs, right? This whole idea that maybe you should wash your hands before you eat and all this stuff was just like, oh, that's a bunch of religious nonsense, because that's what the Bible says, that you need to, be clean and hygienic. And, if you have a skin disease, you don't want to be spreading that around and all that stuff. Oh, that's a bunch of religious nonsense, right? According to folks running around today. So around the same time that Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species in 1859, there's another gentleman by the name of Louis Pasteur, who's busy demonstrating by his experiments with fermentation, and he showed that spontaneous generation is impossible around 1857. And keep in mind, at this time in history, a lot of science is done basically the same way Darwin is doing it, right? Yeah, you got your college degree, but most of what you learn, you're just following around people that you like. You found some, like Louis Pasteur, some guy that's out there on the front lines doing the research, and like, okay, so you need food, you need a cook, you need somebody to drive you around, you need, all these things that are not related to science. So I want to help you out and just basically sort of be like a sponge over here. A disciple, if you will, just kind of hanging out and learning from the stuff that you're doing. And so Louis Pasteur has this little group that follows him around everywhere and is starting to do all these experiments. And Louis Pasteur is French, okay? And as a French guy, he's very concerned that a lot of the wine that they produce in France is spoiling. Okay, it's going sour, right? And they were having a real hard time figuring out why only some of the wine would go sour and other wine would not go sour, and it was perfectly fine. And Pasteur figured out that all of the sour wine had bacteria in it. Okay, little microscope. He's going around all these vineyards doing experiments. Can we have some samples, please? And the farmer's like, sure, can't sell it. And whereas the other wine that hadn't gone sour didn't have these critters in there. So Pasteur is like, okay, so in some cases we don't have these guys growing, and in other cases we do. So if we can keep these guys from growing in the wine, maybe we wouldn't lose half of our crop every year to wine. And I know a lot of Christians don't really like alcohol, but we're not talking about modern day wine here, okay? Modern day wine is usually somewhere in the neighborhood like 15 to 20% alcohol, okay? That's not possible to reach those concentrations in nature. Naturally, wine is about 3% to maybe 5% alcohol. Everybody drank wine. It was just normal, you know.
They get those high percentages by distilling it.
Right. Distillation, which again,
Getting rid
you
of
had a lot of
water.
problems. First of all, you can distill alcohol like isopropyl alcohol. It's like that will kill you. Okay, so a lot of people died from poorly distilled alcohol, right? And others from alcohol poisoning. Anyway, so this stuff again, very similar to what Jesus Christ probably drank when he was on the earth. And a lot of people even watered it down. Like in the Bible, Paul tells Timothy, look, stop drinking only water, take a little wine. Why? Because they would mix water with wine because a 1% alcohol concentration will kill all the parasites in the water. Nobody just drank water. Like nobody.
I didn't know
Okay.
that.
Because water has parasites in it. And how are you going to preserve your crop anyway?
Botulism.
Yeah.
Botulism.
Yeah, some pretty bad stuff, man. This will rot your face off. This will make you puke your guts out. This will be like you don't want any of that stuff running around. And this is still a major problem in many areas of the world where they just can't get clean water. Okay. There's whole ministries. Do what? Well, that would help. I mean, it really would. If they mix what they drink, they can't afford it probably, but many places in France, wine is actually cheaper than water. Because water has to be purified. Yeah, to this day. Yeah, you go to a restaurant and you look at the menu, water is more expensive. They call it mineral water. Right? Expensive French water. Anyway, so Louis Pasteur is going around doing his experiments on wine, figuring out that in 100 cases out of 100, if there's sour wine, there's these little critters in there that maybe are turning it sour. And so if we can maybe keep those guys out. So he's talking to the farmers. And he's like, look, if you can do things that, first of all, don't reuse those casks, okay, because they're contaminated, and then keep them separate and, and he's making progress. And the farmers are like, wow, this guy's saving us a crap load of money. And so he's getting popular. If you figure out how to double the profit of somebody, they're going to really like you, okay? So Pasteur has a following. People really like this guy. However, he's coming up against people's worldview, right? A lot of scientists hate it because he's suggesting that things can't just pop out of the ground, that you could actually design a system where you kept the germs out of the wine and therefore germs wouldn't form in the wine. And so they start an argument. Now, ladies, this is insight into the nature of males, okay?
Okay, I was mistaken.
Males will argue a lot, even if it doesn't matter, okay? It's stupid, I know. I do the same thing. But I get together with my airsoft buddies and talk about, this type of BB and that type of, cylinder system and this compression rate and that spring ratio. And yeah, it doesn't really matter, okay? So anyway, there's a lot of debate. A lot of scientists don't like Louis Pasteur, but he's got a huge following. And so they sort of start arguing louder and louder and louder until finally somebody gets on like, all right, let's have a showdown. This town's not big enough for the two of us, right? And, they started calling each other names. You low down son of a one-eyed prairie dog, and that kind of stuff happens. And anyway, so there ends up being an experiment, okay? Pasteur figures out, has this notion, this idea, this hypothesis that he's been working on, that spontaneous generation is impossible. If you keep the germs out of there, you're going to preserve your crop. And not just with wine, but with milk. And actually recommended a whole procedure, which now called pasteurization, where you heat it up and you kill the bacteria that might have gotten in there. Do what?
I don't like that.
I know, right? It's a French name. There's a sign language joke about milk, right? This is milk, and this is pasteurized milk. That's all the sign language I know. Okay. So anyway, pasteurization is heating up the wine or the milk or whatever, killing the bacteria that might have gotten in there, and thereby preserving the crop until you get a high enough alcohol concentration built up that it just preserves itself indefinitely. Okay. which of course doesn't happen with milk, so it still has a shelf life. Okay. Anyway, so most of the scientific community is not super happy with Pasteur. There's a whole bunch of debate and division. The French Academy of Sciences offered, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, a prize and 2,500 francs to anyone who could conclusively demonstrate either that spontaneous generation had happened somewhere or that it was impossible. Okay. Well, you know what Pasteur did. Well, he designed his famous swan-necked flask experiment. Okay. Now, he'd been criticized a little bit before then, okay, because some of these guys who were trying to win the prize money would take a little flask of chicken broth or whatever, and they would heat it up until it just barely boiled, then they take it off the heat. Okay. And of course, it would still have a few bacteria in there, and you get a population of, you get all this gunk growing in there. Okay. Pasteur sealed his containers. Okay. And of course, that made them all upset because they were like, well, air is necessary for spontaneous generation. You cut off the air, so obviously spontaneous generation is not going to happen. So then Pasteur got really creative with the whole thing. And he made this whole swan-necked flask. You can still get air in there, but if you try to get little dust particles and things like that that might carry bacteria with them, they'll all kind of fall out, and they won't be able to get into the broth. He also designed one with a special filter on the top of it, and it didn't grow bacteria either. Okay, so you boil the broth for a good couple of minutes, kill everything totally dead, and you set it over there, and you can stare at it as long as you want. It's not going to grow bacteria. I understand there's a museum in France that still has some of Pasteur's flasks that have never grown bacteria in them.
But they didn't go sour?
Well, I mean, it's broth or whatever it is. So yeah, it doesn't go sour. Just sits there. And eventually turns into some kind of gel because the water does evaporate over time. Things like
Broth
that.
will do that anyways.
Yeah, it's kind of gelatin. Anyway, so somebody said, oh, well, you've by boiling it, you've destroyed the broth's ability to spontaneously generate. And he proved that nope, if you break the flask, if you break the top of it off, 24 hours later, you get a nice film of bacteria in there. In fact, you don't even have to break off the top of the neck. You just swish it around and expose it to the air for a little while. And bacteria, hey presto, 24 hours later, a healthy population of critters and bugs running around in there. And that is why we know Louis Pasteur's name. All right. He demonstrated this so convincingly that he won the prize money in 1862, like 3 years after Darwin publishes his book. You cannot get living things from non-living things. And Pasteur was pretty proud of himself, so let's see what he had to say about that. Never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. There is no known circumstance in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, that is, without parents similar to themselves. Woo! Well, that sounds an awful lot like what God said about creation, doesn't it? Something about organisms reproducing after their kinds or something like that. Okay. Nothing has changed in 150 years. Spontaneous generation is actually significantly more impossible than we ever thought that it was. We're going to talk about that. Okay. Now, you got to understand history. Cartwright is famous for saying the only subject more important than science is history. You got to understand a little bit of your history. So on this slide, we have some cells which are magnified about 250 times magnification, which is the best microscope anybody had available to them at that time. Okay. So Pasteur's experiments do not convince everyone, which is annoying, but that is the nature of science, right? It's annoying the other way these days when every time a study comes out, people are like, oh my gosh, this thing. And you're like, oh, dude, just Give it a little time. Let it breathe. Right? There's been 20 or 40 studies on coffee. Half of them showing that it's bad for you, and half of them showing that it's good for you.
Oh.
So my position, of course, is, well, if it's that bad for you, I mean, it can't be that bad for you if half of the studies show that it's good for you, right? I don't know if that's true.
The caffeine part isn't the best for you. But, I mean,
In moderation, all things in moderation.
Yeah.
I mean, Cartwright sleeping on the table, that's not good for you. I mean, that's,
it might not be good for you either. You might put it for back.
Yeah, that could be dangerous. Anyway, so there's gravity involved. Anyway, so driving, driving half asleep, that might not be good. So it's everything in moderation, right? Except for uranium, maybe lead. So the thing is, there is wisdom, guys, in being a little bit stubborn when it comes to new information. All right, because there's always a chance that it's not quite correct. And this is why it's so important to read the entire study and not just the headline, right? And we've talked about this before, but one of the key studies that was used as justification for mask mandates in America was a study of the healthcare system in Michigan involving about 60,000 doctors. And the title of the article said something like, "Why universal masking should be done now," right? And if you read the study, you figure out that when they implemented universal masking in the hospital, the positive test ratio dropped from 21% to 14%, which is that is statistically significant. Okay. However, if you read the whole study, you'll also figure out that at that same time, cases were already leveling off in Michigan. And we all know the hospitals are the front lines of that. So if your cases are leveling off in Michigan, they're already starting to decrease in the hospitals because those folks got exposed first. They're, exposure levels way higher than everybody else. And so they're going to see the change in that curve before everyone else. You also figure out that during that same time that they were running the study, they completely automated the testing process. So they figure out that the doctors and nurses, whoever's out there, administering the COVID test has an extreme exposure rate. And so they stopped doing that and they totally automated the whole thing. All right. So maybe that's why the positive test rate dropped from 21 to 14, right? So you've got to be able to think for yourself. You've got to be able to read, and don't just trust whatever the media throws at you. If there's anything 2020 taught you, hopefully it taught you that, right? There's certain wisdom in just being stubborn, but you always have to qualify this. You always have to say, okay, well, what evidence would convince me that the X, Y, or Z is true? What evidence would convince me that spontaneous generation is impossible, right? How can we redesign? What's wrong with the experiment, in other words, right? What's wrong with Pasteur's experiment that you think that spontaneous generation is still possible, scientifically speaking? Well, what's wrong with the mask mandate in California that it's not working? They got twice the infection rate in Texas and Florida. What's wrong? How come? They've been in lockdown since March. They've had a mask mandate since almost then. Now they have twice the infection rate of Texas and Florida. Florida actually outlawed mask mandates. So why is it not working there? Okay, you've got to have an open mind about this. Humans feel way too much, most of them, to look at it with a critical eye. And you have things that you feel about this way too. The study came out showing that bacon was bad for you. You'd be like, oh well, right? And there have been studies like that. I think they're flawed. There have been studies that came out that show that sugar is not bad for you. Commissioned by sugar manufacturers.
Yeah.
It's funny, you get what you pay for. You've heard that phrase. It's also true. If you just pay for something, you can just get it. Like a study showing that sugar's not bad for you.
Anything can kill you in certain amounts.
Hey, look, dude, iron is an essential nutrient. You eat a bucket of nails, it's going to ruin your day, right? Don't try that, by the way.
3 gallons of water, you're probably gonna die.
Your kidneys are not going to appreciate that. Okay, so we can forgive them. It is human nature. There is wisdom in being slow to absorb information, but it's a lot better if you recognize a revolution when it happens, right? And I don't think that you do. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that podcasts have revolutionized education. The spoken word today is as common or as readily available to most people as the written word. Podcasts are basically the Gutenberg press, people. That is insane. That's never happened before. I can listen to Jordan Peterson in traffic. I don't even mind traffic anymore. It's like, well, cranking up the podcast, right? Anyway, so can you recognize something that should change your life when it happens? Most of the time, in the midst of the storm, you don't. Okay. So anyway, so there's diehards out there. Oh, well, we don't know the conditions of the past, and we don't know what, thousands of years ago. Maybe spontaneous regeneration was possible thousands of years ago, and they just ignored it. I know. Call themselves scientists. We have come a long way, baby, in our understanding of what makes a cell work. By the way, this is our understanding of what made a cell work circa 1980. It is now impossible to describe in a single picture how a cell works. We'll get to that. Okay, so we know so much about a living cell that we actually have to start at the protein level. So if we're going to understand why spontaneous generation is impossible and just how impossible it is, we got to start at the bottom. So what are proteins made of? They are made of amino acids. First one is lysine. You take cell molecular biology, you'll have to memorize the structures for all of them. And it has a structure something like that. You notice I didn't say it looks like that. It doesn't look like anything. It's too small to look like anything. You cannot see that molecule unless you have an X-ray crystallographic diffraction machine. You can detect its structure, but it doesn't have an image. Okay. So that's lysine. This is the little stick figure version of it that you might see or draw yourself in organic chemistry. And this is something that you would get. You put it into a computer, and the computer knows the properties of nitrogen and carbon and all that stuff. Okay. This is all 20 amino acids. Just trying to show you that there are quite a few differences between them. All right. Some of them are electrically charged. Some of them are polar. Some of them are non-polar. Never mind. I never memorized them. Okay, so how do you build these things? They are the bricks. You've got to arrange them in a specific order in order to get a protein to work for you. Okay. So, for example, ribonuclease. Ribonuclease is the smallest protein known to science. It consists of 17 amino acids arranged in a chain 124 amino acids long. And here's the deal, guys. You have to get the order correct. If you get these things out of order, we call that a mutation. And the reason why it's so dangerous is that when you fold it into a structure, it doesn't fold into the correct structure, and it won't fit in the places in your body that it's supposed to be able to fit, and you can't use it. So you're dead, basically. Okay? So you have to get that order correct. Otherwise, you do not generate the right structure. Okay? This is an X-ray crystallographic image of ribonuclease bound to a transfer RNA. This is the smallest protein known to science. Okay? Have you ever looked at Mozart's music that he wrote by hand? You ever look at that? It looks like chaos, doesn't it? Right? But you hear it played and you're like, whoa, that is insane. I am not intelligent enough to be able to look at that and see the beauty in there. To me, it looks like chaos. It's beautiful. So here's the thing. Here's the thing. If you switch these guys around, okay, the whole thing doesn't work. It doesn't fit properly, and you can't build a cell out of it. And so basically your cell turns back into dirt, because that is actually made out of dirt, right? Meaningful structure requires information. If you are going to build yourself a ribonuclease, by the way, it's impossible.
Okay.
Only cells can do that. All right. No scientist has ever built a protein. Not one. All right.
Yeah.
You have to have information. You cannot put these things into your dryer, set it on high, and eventually out pops a Millennium Falcon. Right? We all know that you have to fold the clothes after it comes out of the dryer.
That one thing where if you like put a monkey in a typewriter,
Yeah.
after a million years, he would have Hamlet's like.
The whole idea that a million monkeys on a million typewriters would eventually reproduce the works of Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, that's what it was.
Yeah. Although I think the internet should have disproved that by now. sorry. So here's the thing. You have to have that information. You cannot run a tornado through a junkyard and get a 747 out of it. It doesn't work. And we're about to describe why it doesn't work. Okay. Information comes from the genetic code. Darwin, of course, had no idea about genetics. Okay. Physical characteristics do not get passed down in a way that makes sense. I know you've looked at your siblings every once in a while and been like, what happened to you? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay. So the thing is, and I think I've told you this before, but you are more genetically different from your siblings than you are from somebody who comes from a different continent. There is a higher degree of genetic variety between siblings than there is between ethnic groups. Sometimes 10 times as much genetic variety. Because most of your genes you can't see, right? The melanin concentration in your skin, your eye color, and your hair color, that's like 3 genes out of 25,000. Okay. So most of it's completely invisible. And you never figure out how different you are unless you like interact with this person and you figure out, okay, this is a totally different human. Right? And your parents get really frustrated because like, okay, this child did this, but this child did that. And this one's chewing through the straps on his seatbelt. Like, what happened? What did we do? Where did we go wrong? You didn't. You just have a different human on there. Right? And some humans are more susceptible to gravity. Okay. Anyway, so sometimes these physical characteristics don't make sense. And so trying to figure out what in the name of logic and reason is happening here is difficult to do. So we need to learn a little bit about genetics. If we're going to study how proteins are made and what God did here and appreciate his handiwork, we're going to need to know about genetics. So we have to start with somebody named Johann Mendel. Mendel comes onto the scene in 1822. He's just a wee bit younger than Charlie Darwin. He's born in. Yeah. So he is born into a farming family, and his dad teaches him how to select for characteristics in livestock and plants and things like that are desirable in the farming world. Okay. And his scientific genius so impressed his middle school teachers that they basically begged his parents to put him in high school. And here's the thing, guys. In high school, a lot of you start asking really important questions like, when am I ever going to use Algebra 2? And I have an answer for you that apparently none of your other teachers are willing to say. You're not. You're not going to use Algebra 2. It's never going to benefit you. Unless you are going on to be an engineer, a chemist, a doctor, a pharmacist, somebody involved, an engineer, somebody involved in the hard sciences. Otherwise, you don't need Algebra 2. So why take it? Do you need chemistry? Do you need physics? No. Not unless God has called you into the medical field or as an engineer or somebody who's going out and studying geology or building bridges and those kinds of things. Otherwise it will never help you. That's a lot of work. for, I don't know, a fancy brain.
So
here's
why
the thing,
isn't it
guys.
optional?
Here's the thing. Do what?
Why isn't it optional?
Should be optional. You're a homeschooler. You can do whatever you
We
want.
should have schools to go to learn the traits.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean.
In every other society for thousands of years, when you got to be 12, 13, 14 years old, your dad would be like, okay, we're Cartwrights, so we make carts. But you might think this is boring. You got candle maker over there. You could go be apprentice to him. You got Joe the plumber. You could go and learn how to do plumbing. You got the baker over there. You got a cute daughter. That's what I thought. Okay, so we're gonna get you an apprenticeship over with the baker over there. And if something happens, it happens. Okay, so if you guys get married, just make sure you get married first. And I'll talk to his dad or her dad to make sure that they're good with it. And basically, you'll probably take over their business. They don't have any sons over there, but we've been friends with them for years. So good family, God-fearing folk, and that's how you did life. Okay, you don't need high school. You do need to read and be able to do basic math, and learn how to balance a checkbook, and all that stuff. You don't need algebra. You don't need chemistry. You don't need physics, unless you're trying to rule the world. The British were trying to rule the world. That's why they were like, look, you can't get married until after college because we got to have people that are smart enough to rule our empire. And that's not going to happen if you guys quit when you're 15 and start raising families. So they destroyed the family on purpose, trying to get more engineers out of them. Okay. Luring you, oh, you can make more money doing it. No, you can't. Plumbers make $100,000 a year. 5 richest professions in America, doctor is not one of them.
Is the engineer one of them?
Nope.
Really?
I don't think so.
I would have thought like more like a petroleum engineer because they.
Richest people I know are all business owners.
That's fair.
None of them went to college. Okay. I actually know an electrical engineer who quit and became a roofer. He owns a roofing business. He owns Heartland. Okay. So you don't need high school to survive in this world. You only need it if your country is trying to rule the entire globe. And is that really what God has called you to do? I don't think so.
Definitely not.
I'm pretty sure that God has called you first to your family and secondly to your church. And maybe when you're old enough, maybe you can worry about what's going on in the state. And I don't know, the empire. America's an empire, okay? We have been for decades. Just get over it. We are. And we need lots of scientists and engineers and, smart people working in weapons factories, because otherwise we don't, we're 4% of the world's population, We own half of the planet. That is why so much pressure is put on people your age to do all of the things. Can we not? Can we just not? When you're 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, the most important thing you can do is work your butt off learning a trade. Save your money. Okay. If God has called you into the medical field, by all means, go.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not trying. Look, I make part of my living teaching those classes. Okay. Absolutely.
You're putting yourself out of the job, Mr. Cartwright. You're telling us no.
I'm trying to do what's best for you guys. Trying to do what's best for the church. Trying to do what's best for humans. Okay. So no, you don't need algebra 2, unless you're going to be an engineer.
And if it's the worst experience of your life, dude, can we not? We're homeschoolers. We don't trust the government with education. Why are we following their recommendations? Why?
I want to take a pause to that. I've never met a public schooler that is smarter than most any of the people here.
Yeah. The average homeschooler scores in the 87th percentile. Did you know that?
Really?
The average homeschooler scores in the 87th percentile. I think if most people knew that, they would lose their flipping minds. Some of my students who do go into the medical field are really worried with my chemistry class. I didn't really prepare them because after all, there's just a bunch of homeschoolers here. I get so many letters back. I had a student graduate chemistry last year, went on to take chemistry at the college level. He's like, okay, so I have a 94 in my chemistry class, the average is 42.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't drink the college Kool-Aid. I really don't, guys. I don't even drink the high school Kool-Aid. All right. And yeah, there's a lot of. My sister dropped out of high school, got married when she was 17, raised a family.
Perfectly fine. Something you want to do.
That's what God called her to do.
Yeah.
So there. But she was smart enough to do it. She hated it. It's like pulling teeth to do algebra. Well,
See, I actually somewhat enjoy it, which is kind of weird.
well, so okay, so you're good at it. You got some aptitude there.
It's not
Maybe
even
it's
that,
worth
like,
exploring.
Some things I'm not good at, I still enjoy doing it. I enjoy
Yeah.
putting more things in my head that
And that's what most people do. Like that's what a lot of humans do in America is what they enjoy doing. I enjoy reloading ammunition. I enjoy teaching.
That's
Right?
a lot of fun.
So that's my advice. We'll continue our discussion of that next week.